Good Sunday morning. I'm Jaden Jefferson, and welcome to this week's Community Focus. I'm happy to welcome back to the show Joel Voss, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toledo. And on today's show, the previous time I had you on the show, we were talking Ukraine, where a war is currently happening. And now we have one between Israel and the group Hamas. But it's a long and complicated story. So for people that are just new to this, talk about what led up to this.
Wow. Well, it is long and complicated, right? So I'm not sure if I can very briefly tell you what led up to this, except that there's been a long history since roughly 1945-ish of Israel and Palestine living in the same region. This, of course, deals with the end of World War II. And since then, Palestine has obviously wanted to, Palestinians have obviously wanted to maintain control of their land in Palestine, and Israel has wanted to expand their land in Palestine, and in the country Israel proper. And so, if I'm going to be really simplistic about it, super simplistic about it, it's in large part over land and resources, if I'm being very simplistic.
What exactly is the root of this dispute?
Well, the longer term issue, right, not necessarily the October 7th issue, is that Israel controls Palestine, right? It controls Gaza and the West Bank, in the Sinai Peninsula. And although Israel says that it allows Palestinians to have elections and their own services and things like that, right? Ostensibly, they're still ruled or controlled by Israel, right? Israel creates borders for Palestine that allows people to go in and out between Israel and Palestine, or Egypt, or Jordan. So it's if you're a Palestinian, you're arguing that this is about self-determination, I guess, if I'm again being quite simplistic.
And the group Hamas is a group that a lot of people are just now hearing about, but they've been on the scene a while. And the thing is, a lot of times we tend to just tie Hamas and Palestine together when really Hamas is something, it's its own vehicle. So kind of explain the separation between Hamas and just Palestinians.
Well, sure. So you can look at this as a difference between, say, Gaza and the West Bank. You could look at it as a difference between political parties and organizations, so on and so forth, right? So you can think about Palestinians at large, and then, of course, they have numerous political parties within Palestine, right? So Fatah used to be the primary political party, and that was led by Yasser Arafat before he died. And then Hamas really started taking over in the what is it? I think it was the mid 2000s or so, 2007, 1997. My timing is now getting a bit off as I get older. But they essentially came on, and they gained a lot of power and influence because they didn't think that the previous organizations like Fatah were doing enough, right, to get Palestinian self-determination. And so they came in and they were a bit more militant. And that appealed to some people over others.
When looking at what happened on the 7th, why do you think these attacks were launched at this time?
Okay, well, those are two big questions, right? Two different sort of questions. One, I think it appeared abrupt, right? At least the scale of the attacks were almost certainly abrupt, compared to things that had happened in prior attacks by Hamas. And so most of us were taken a bit, actually, we were taken a lot by surprise at the sheer breadth of the attack by Hamas. It does look like, according to reports, maybe Egypt had warned Israel about some type of attack occurring. That all has to be, of course, independently verified, right? But by most accounts, it was quite a surprise, right? And it's even more shocking given the size of it. Now, the why now part is complicated, and I don't have a clear answer, and most of us don't have a clear answer. A lot of people are suggesting that, including Washington, D.C., right, the government, is suggesting that it has something to do with movements to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia and Israel. And so Hamas is acting as a spoiler in that bid because they don't want Israel to have more normalized relations with its Arab neighbors. And that's a pretty classic thing to do, actually. You see terrorist organizations do this almost anytime there are normalized relationships or peace agreements. You see a group come on, make an attack, and hopefully spoil it. That's the technical term. They're spoiling the agreements. And so I think that's plausible. Honestly, I'm still a bit shocked at the size of the attack because we knew that Israel would respond. They had to respond. And they respond with a good amount of force anytime Hamas does an attack. But when it's something this large, I think most of us were expecting a very large response. And it's not something that Hamas. I guess I'm a bit confused about the strategy that Hamas was using. Even if they were spoiling, the size of this attack was just extremely large. Let me just stop there, I suppose.
There are many people that say, why are we so quick to stand behind Israel? So kind of explain why that relationship is so important.
Well, again, there are a lot of theories about the US's relationship with Israel. One prevailing theory is that we support Israel over most of the other states in the Middle East because Israel is a democracy and other states aren't. And so it's been the US's foreign policy position to support democracies, or at least democracies that are allied with the United States across the world. And so if you look at it from that position, it makes sense that we would support Israel in that, geopolitically, right? Another sort of position, another geopolitical position is that we don't necessarily care about whether they're not a democracy. What we care about is that they are in conflict with Iran. So in this sense, this could help explain our help of Saudi Arabia, right? Because you can think of it as a triangle where Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel are all sort of geopolitical rivals. We're most concerned with Iran, and so we ally with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, one way, of course, to test that hypothesis is if Israel no longer was considered a democracy, would we still support them? And if we did, it would most likely be because we're concerned about Iran and geostrategic interest. Two other explanations, and I know this is a long answer, is that perhaps the Israeli lobby is very strong in the United States, like the Cuban lobby. I don't know that that's the best explanation because although lobbies are powerful, you're asking us to do a whole lot for that lobby. And I just don't know that there's enough evidence for that. And the final sort of explanation that some people use is that it has to do with religion, and I'm not sure that's the best explanation either. But I'm not a professor of religion, right? So
when it comes to incidents like this, where we have Americans who could be in harm's way and are in harm's way, what exactly is the procedure for getting them back home? How do you think internally the U.S. is responding to this? Because we're only seeing the exterior things.
Oh, you can bet the United States is on the phone nearly 24/7 with Israel and Gaza to make sure that any American gets out safely, right? So if there's a concern, and it looks like there are American hostages, right, with Gaza, they're going to be using mediators to pressure Hamas, excuse me. They're going to pressure mediators to get Hamas to release those captives who are likely held in Gaza, and they're going to use both carrots and sticks. They're essentially going to say, if you don't release our hostages, right, you can't expect any help from us. Or if you don't release our hostages, perhaps you could expect even more sanctions from us, right? It's a sort of classic thing that you see. But yeah, you can almost certainly bet that any foreign country that has citizens inside of Gaza right now or on the border are working very hard to get their citizens out.
And we're seeing a lot of videos on social media, which I always tell people, do approach with skepticism with anything you see online. But there are a lot of videos that are coming through of just really harsh, just tragic, and just injuries and deaths on both sides. And so in terms of looking at that with the eye of someone who studied this, just what difference does it make having the ability to actually have the rest of the world see what's happening?
Well, like Ukraine and Russia, right? It makes it more personal to see people being injured. And I think that does get people a little more involved in what's happening. Um, Especially in something like Ukraine and Russia, where although we do have some Ukrainians here and some Russians here in Toledo, um, it's not a significant population. Where on the other hand, we have quite a large population of Palestinians, Jews, and Middle Easterners, right? Like Lebanese individuals, for example. And so they already have it a bit more personalized. But for like the average layperson, it really brings it home. What I hope that it does is it brings it home in a way that we want to solve a conflict, not in the way that we treat it as entertainment.
The dispute's been going on for decades, but in terms of this war here, how long do you expect this to last? And I know that's one of those difficult questions because you really never know where things could go.
Well, it's a tough question, right? We can look back into recent history and look at a couple of different intifadas, which were like simplistically speaking, uprisings, right, by Palestinians against Israel, and each of those lasted 4-ish years, right? There was no definitive end to the second one, but let's ballpark them at 4-ish years. The difference here is that the conflict has really started burning fast, where in the intifadas it was a bit slower of a burn, and so on the one hand, you might think that, hey, maybe it'll come to a resolution sooner because there's a lot of pressure to end this. On the other hand, it doesn't look like it looks like Israel's going to do a ground invasion, and then Hamas will, of course, retaliate, and this could roll on for quite a long time. I'm not in a. I don't want to make a solid guess because it's a tough thing to measure, but I would expect it could last a couple of years.
And it's definitely a difficult job to take so much history and just compile it into a shorter interview. But thank you so much for your time and taking the time to just break this down for a lot of us who are just now maybe being exposed to this conflict. So Joel Voss, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toledo, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Jaden.
Thank you. And that's this week's Community Focus. Have a great week.